Welcome back. Professor Roundtree here, Marketing 3401. We're into Chapter 12, where we talk about marketing channels, delivering customer value. Marketing channels, basically when we say channels, we're talking about the place P, the distribution part of selling physical products. We can talk a little bit about services as well, but primarily what we're going to be talking about in this chapter looks at a physical distribution for a physical product. Now, many of you have probably heard of the phrase supply chain and supply chain management. Essentially, it's all the steps and stages and groups of organizations that stand between someone who produces something and someone who buys it for consumption, meaning end consumers like us. And so we'll talk about the different types of marketing channels, how some of them are more important than others. We'll talk about different kinds of behaviors and different types of organizations that make up a channel. We'll talk about channel design, what might be an ideal way to create and form a channel if there is a best way. And then we'll talk about how you actually manage a channel. What kinds of decisions are you faced with when you are part of a channel or you're trying to manage multiple stages within the channel. And then lastly, we'll talk about some public policy issues related to distribution, and then talk about the concept of marketing logistics and supply chain management. So you'll see in many organizations, supply chain management and logistics are lumped together, and they may or may not be closely connected within the organization to the marketing department. It really kind of depends on how large they are. Some relatively small companies, they manage the whole thing in terms of relationships within the supply chain, but it's also part of the marketing department. Large companies, supply chain is a huge department. It may actually have hundreds of people in that department alone. So we want to first make a contrast between the different types of partners that a manufacturer or producer might have. They typically characterize it into two different types. One is called the upstream partners and the other is a downstream partner. Typically, your upstream partners are going to be the ones who actually sell you the parts, the raw materials. So if you happen to be a manufacturer of computers like Dell or Hewlett Packard, the folks who sell you the Intel chips, or Intel would be a company selling you the Intel chips, the motherboards, the video cards, the RAM, all the stuff that goes into it as a component part. If you manufacture an automobile, anybody who is selling you pistons and rubber for the tires, spark plugs, all leather, all the stuff that goes into making that, those are your upstream partners. Now, the downstream partners are the ones who are trying to get the product into the hands of the consumers. So depending on the complexity of the channel, you might have a wholesaler and a retailer, or you might have just a retailer, or what we might call a distributor. If we're talking about an automobile, it's automobile distributorships. So let's just contrast. We've all heard of supply chain. Obviously, when we think about a supply chain type of organizational structure, that is very similar to what we would call more of a product-oriented kind of structure. Very common. It's been around for ages, and I guess no one's really thinking about changing it. Although you do get some of the market-oriented stuff through other aspects of marketing, through research to try to figure out what needs are unmet, like we talked about earlier in the semester, and figure out what products need to be made. But for a demand chain, that really kind of flips it a little bit and focuses more on developing a chain or a channel that really starts with the whole marketing oriented concept in trying to understand what these needs are and then organize and build a chain around that. Typically, most of the time, it's going to be more of a top-down. We're going to have a supply chain to create products. And, of course, there is some research that goes on to figure out what to actually make. So at the end of the day, we're really trying to create a system, a network, where we can, again, getting back to that basic concept, we're trying to deliver better value to our customers relative to what competitors are offering. And so it's going to involve the suppliers, distributors, the customers themselves, any partner that's involved in terms of financing or delivery, anything that goes into providing value in this network to our ultimate consumer. Now, a word that I think many people have looked at is the whole notion of this word intermediary. That is all the intermediary steps or organizations that are in between producers of stuff and buyers of stuff. And anytime we have a channel, and in the next couple of slides from now, we'll talk about the structure of channels, and some of them are more complex, some of them are shorter, and some of them are wider or longer and shorter. But at the end of the day, any organization who gets between someone who produces stuff and people who buy and consume stuff, the theory is they should be adding some value to the relationship. They perform some role, some function that the producer themselves cannot perform, that is valued and needed by end user customers. And so these intermediaries really should provide something of value. And those things of value we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. But these added value things, these are what we would call bridge factors, things that really allow the producer to focus on producing and then taking over roles that would ultimately get the product in the hands of the end user. Again, this whole concept of adding value. In other words, if you add value, then you basically get paid for it. Every link in the chain, a supply chain that we have that's between people who produce stuff and people like us who consume stuff, they have to make a profit based on their contribution. In other words, what it means is that the price is marked up and we pay more for whatever the service is that they're actually performing. So here are a couple of examples. Take a look at the one on the left. I mean, the one on the left, as you can imagine, these are multiple manufacturers, independent, and these are people like us, consumers. Now, if you look at the way it's structured here, this is very chaotic. We have all these manufacturers all trying to achieve the very same goal: sell their stuff to consumers. Now, enter a what I would call a very simplistic supply chain, where all there really is a distributor, someone who has a direct relationship with the manufacturer, and they're able to communicate directly with the customer. Very simple kind of supply chain here. I guess the real point is this is a lot more organized than this chaos that's going on right here. So when people are added to the channel, again, added to the channel meaning they're a link between people who produce stuff and people who consume stuff for their end use. These are some of the more common roles that people perform, these value-added kinds of services. And so the people in the middle may have really great information about the consumer marketplace. They may know a lot more about consumers than the manufacturer does. Or they just may know more about the industry and the technical side of what the manufacturer is creating, thereby being able to communicate and persuade and inform people who are looking to buy. And they typically can be good at promotion. I mean, they're spreading some kind of persuasive information about them. They may have expertise in, creating physical sales material that you might see in a physical retail store. They may have great information that they can send out to people through electronic means, email, and the like, all providing something that is going to persuade people to walk into the store. Again, the whole contact issue, kind of getting at this whole notion that they have some kind of relationship somehow with end consumers, end users, that maybe the manufacturer actually doesn't. They may do some of these what we call matching kinds of functions. Maybe they're actually there to actually do some final assembly of the product. You see this a lot in furniture, where some of these folks who are in the middle between producers and end users, they might perform a function where they actually put the final product together. or they might actually take that final product and create some packaging. Very important when we're talking about shipping something that is perishable. Maybe they provide some kind of refrigerated containers that manufacturers don't have. So they're getting fresh flowers or fresh produce into the hands of the consumers because they're providing refrigerated storage and transportation. Many times, too, they're also very good at negotiating and financing. At the end of the day, they're going to be taking some kind of risk. And so going back to the example of those who are doing transportation for perishable items, obviously once you put fresh flowers in a refrigerated container, if for some reason something goes wrong with that freight train or those individual trucks and then the flowers perish, it's really up to the person in the middle, the organization in the middle, to kind of make good on that. And so the manufacturer, or in this case here with the flowers, the growers, those are the ones who say, we know about growing flowers. We don't know about how to keep them fresh for the next 14 days before they get into the hands of the consumers. So we're going to hire and partner with a professional who knows exactly how to do that. So here's a couple more examples of different types of channels. The one on the right is more of what we would call a business marketing channel. Essentially, the end consumer is a business customer. We're going to focus more, though, on the consumer side. And as you look at this, we have multiple layers. And this is what I mean by having multiple links. You have a producer, a wholesaler, a retailer, and a consumer. And then here you have more of a producer who sells directly to retailers, and they sell it directly to us as consumers. This one here is more of what we would call direct channels. So your Dells, for example, are your traditional direct channels. Here in producers, in the same context, we might say Hewlett-Packard is more in channel number 2. They produce the product, but then they sell it to Best Buy. And Best Buy is going to actually eventually sell it to us as end consumers. You could have a flower grower up here. They grow roses, and there's a wholesaler who buys it from them. They refrigerate it and keep them fresh, transport it, and eventually it gets to the local FTD shop where we walk into the shop and we pick out those flowers. So the channel needs to be customized based on the product and the needs of the channel itself, being the producer as well as the consumers. Anytime we add anybody to this chain, it's going to add more cost to the end consumer. Now, we can have multiple channel levels. There is no magic bullet, magic number. Again, it really depends on the complexity of the product, the natural flow of the product itself. So for example, anything that's perishable, you're going to have multiple layers of expertise and skill and resources. For example, refrigerated containers and transport vehicles. That's not something that most transport companies will have. These are going to be very specialist kinds of companies, and their objective really is to make sure that those fresh flowers get to us fresh, or the fruit that they actually pick from the banana plant will actually get to the stores and are not fully ripe. So they have all sorts of technology that they use to keep things fresh. Can you imagine someone who's manufacturing ice cream and the fact that it has to get to the retailer at some point where it's still frozen? So there's definitely a need for some of these. They help in terms of keeping the physical product in a condition that's going to be beneficial for the end consumer. They extend the life of some of these products. The shelf life that we see for example, strawberries, by the time we get them and eat them, unless they come from a farmer's market, by the time we eat strawberries, those things were probably picked about a week and a half before that, maybe even more. Bananas are around the same thing, and so they have certain procedures where they keep the bananas fresh and prevent them from ripening a little bit too quickly. So next, we want to talk a little bit about this whole notion of conflict. No, so whenever you hear the term channel conflict, that essentially means that there is some conflict with regard to roles, responsibilities, some of it contractual, some of it not contractual. But in essence, all they're saying is, are people within the distribution channel, are they performing their roles to the best of their abilities that allow others? Think about it as a relay race. If we have multiple people in the channel to get the product from producer to end consumer, it's like a relay race. One person may provide a role that might relate to more the expediency to actually ship something. And another one may provide that very, very last leg of the distribution before it actually gets to the retail outlet. So having a physical warehouse where you can store something overnight when hundreds of trucks roll in before it's actually sent out to either distribution center or sent out to the actual retail stores. So they all perform different roles. And the question is always, do they all know their roles? And the conflict arises oftentimes when there's some confusion about who should be doing what. So I guess the basic thing is you need to know your role and you need to stay in your lane, and eventually the channel will work a lot smoother than it otherwise would. So again, you'll hear this whole notion of channel conflict, and the conflict can be up and down the chain, and the conflict can be across the chain. So you might have multiple retailers, and there's some conflict about who actually gets the latest and the greatest PS4 when that comes out, and the allocation of how many units they might get, for example, at Walmart relative to Target. So all those things can be conflict that needs to be worked out oftentimes, not so much between Walmart and Target, but between the manufacturer of the PS4s. And so sometimes the conflict is there. You want to keep everybody happy and motivate and give them incentive to continue to do well in selling what it is that you're actually selling. Conventional distribution systems, I mean, these consist of some independents, and many of them are independent. One of the keys I think that really is important to understand when we're talking about all these different things, organizations that are in between producers of stuff and consumers of stuff, a lot of times they're union organized, which creates a whole new set of problems in terms of how you can get them to do things. For something really simple, by, if you have a shipment that's delayed that's coming overseas on a shipping container over the ocean from Europe as an example, and it gets there a few hours late for whatever the reasons might be, the people at the dock who are responsible for taking the product and then moving it down the supply chain to eventually get to the wholesaler or to the retailer, if it gets there late, they may not be in a position to pay their people overtime, and they can't work if they've been working a certain number of hours. So there's all sorts of stuff that can go on when it comes to the conflict that you might see in a particular organization. That's why it's really important to have a very strong manufacturer who really has good control over its distribution channel and supply chain. And so usually you have strong leadership. Larger companies usually have this thing well under control. Not to say they don't have problems, but they have it under control. Now I want to take a few minutes to talk about vertical marketing systems and kind of contrast some of the various types that we have. And some of them, we have some fancy words, but we have definitely heard of most of these. But we may not have thought about it in terms of how we would characterize them as contractual marketing systems, for example. So let's take them one at a time. Corporate vertical marketing systems here. I mean, here we're talking about organizations that vertically integrate. A good example of this is Apple. I mean, they actually produce their product. They also distribute their product directly. You can buy it on the apple.com website, or you can go to their physical retail store. Now, that is one structured channel that they have. And a lot of times that is in conflict to actually trying to distribute your physical product in a retailer like Best Buy. And so the question is always, okay, as a user or a consumer, you probably say, well, if I go and buy it directly from Apple in the Apple store, why isn't it cheaper than actually going to a Best Buy and buying the exact same iPad? Well, the reality is they can't make it a different price cheaper, although the margins obviously are a lot better when we buy it directly from them. Or we buy an iPhone when we go to the AT&T store, we're buying it through a retailer. They're all getting paid, but you really don't want to create this channel conflict, especially when you have products where there is a direct distribution channel and then there's one that involves a retailer. But these corporate vertical marketing systems typically are when a manufacturer decides that they want to just take the ball and run with it and sell it pretty much directly to consumers, but through different steps or channels within this VMS system. So, for example, Dell selling online is very different from Apple selling in the actual Apple store. So one is using the internet as a vehicle to sell directly, and the other is having a physical brick and mortar store to actually connect with consumers. Now, these contractual vertical marketing systems, the most common thing that we see in this category are franchises, and I think we all pretty much know what franchises are. They're contractual relationships with someone who typically owns the brand, and what they do is they contractually give you for a fee the right to use the branding and the name. They also lock you in terms of how much you have to buy all your supplies and your products through them, from napkins, if we're talking about McDonald's, ketchup, the meat, the soft drinks, all the stuff funnels through McDonald's corporate. So these franchises, I mean, we have several different types here in terms of how they're organized. They did several different kinds of stages in the production distribution process. The first one is the manufacturer-sponsored retail systems. For example, Ford and some of the other automobile distributorships, they have these dealerships, these distributorships, and essentially Ford is selling directly to these distributors who eventually try to get us into the showroom so we can actually sell or buy the product directly from them. Manufacturer-sponsored wholesale franchise systems. A good example of that is someone like a Coca-Cola or Pepsi, where essentially what they do is they sell the right to have a bottling company, and it's usually regionally distributed. There is some regional exclusivity in terms of the rights that you get to sell Coca-Cola to the retail, and the retail could be the stores, it could be the bars and restaurants who serve them in little spigots there. And so what they do is they sell them the syrup, and then they give them and they sell them all the supplies that allow them to basically put the product together, the seltzer water and that kind of stuff. So basically all the bottling is done at the distributor level. Coca-Cola corporate essentially sells them the syrup, which is sort of like the secret sauce. And then they add in the seltzer water and all that kind of stuff, and then they actually bottle it. So in that particular case there, Coca-Cola, their main role is selling syrup. And so they don't get involved in any bottling at the company. They're there to market the brand. But the actual manufacturing, they sell the syrup. The bottlers will actually take the syrup and then turn it into the Coke or the Pepsi that we know. These service-sponsored retail kinds of systems, that's your traditional, your Burger King, your Wendy's, Hertz and Avis, they're traditional franchises. Companies like Massage Envy, those are all your traditional types of service firms that are more franchise based. Now, I think I alluded to this whole notion of power and conflict. I think I mentioned conflict. I don't think I mentioned power yet. Power is a concept that's used in marketing channels to discuss the relative power amongst all the people who are in the actual value chain. But primarily when they say conflict or power, they're really focusing on the producers, the manufacturers like Procter & Gamble, and the retailers. The key takeaway I want you to have from this is that over the years, the channel power has shifted from manufacturers to retailers. It used to be a time when Procter & Gamble had all the power in the supply chain. And the retailers would basically just sell whatever it was that Procter & Gamble said they wanted shelf space for. Today, in today's marketplace, because of technology and barcode scanning and the like, retailers know more about what we as consumers buy than the manufacturers do. So the power is really a result of the information and the source of information. So the more you know about the consumers relative to your partners, the more power you have. So Walmart, hugely powerful. Target, hugely powerful. Now, of course, the larger manufacturers still have power, the Procter & Gambles of the world. That's not going to change. But when it comes to truly understanding consumers, the retailers, through all the barcoding stuff, they not only know what we buy, but they know in conjunction with what we buy, what other things we buy, and how far we will actually drive or walk or take a bus to get to that location based on what we know about them. A lot of the information can come through some of these loyalty programs that they have where they scan the card and they know a little bit more about us. Manufacturers, they know a lot about us, but it's through research. It's not through behavior. And so typically they can talk a lot about intentions. They can't talk about how many items we bought and what other items we bought and what was the time period between the time we bought it, time period A, and the next time we came back. So again, power is there, but they have that power because they know a lot more about us as consumers. Horizontal marketing systems, I mean, these are going to be the ones, again, horizontal meaning it's not going up or down the supply chain. They're very similar in terms of how they're trying to connect with consumers. You see this a lot when it comes to some of these partnerships, for example, with Starbucks and McDonald's, and they're in the actual retail stores. They're in Walmart's and some of the others. And so you can go shop at Walmart or Target or wherever, but at the very same time, you can go jump into Subways and have something to eat. And so that has become very, very popular. It's a great way to get into the distribution channel, if you're talking about food, where people shop. And many people take a break. They look at it as a logical place to actually go to have a meal before they do something that they would normally do anyway, which is shopping. Ironically, one of the more popular types of horizontal marketing systems that we had, as recently as like 5 years ago, but definitely 15 years ago, it was you could find a Blockbuster in every major city in whatever the largest retail grocery chain was. And oftentimes they took up huge physical spaces. I mean, their stores were huge relative to the size of what you might have seen elsewhere. A lot of times it would be the same size as the standalone stores. But as we know, Blockbuster has since gone out of business. And again, but it was a very profitable relationship for them once upon a time ago. Take a few minutes here to talk about some of these hybrid marketing channels in terms of how things are actually structured. And again, these are things are going to also, some of these hybrid relationships also create tension as well. And so the next slide kind of gives us an example in terms of what we might potentially see in some of these channels. The conflict oftentimes arises. For example, a company like John Deere, they produce, high volume, large capacity types of farm equipment. And so traditionally what they would do is they would produce the product and they would have these dealerships where they would sell directly, distributors would sell directly to the dealers, and we as consumers would actually go and purchase these things. This is the larger ones for more the business side. But the consumers now, we can actually go and buy some of these John Deere products by going to a place like Home Depot. Now, that creates a problem if you happen to be these dealers, if you believe you want to spread out into more consumer-based types of selling compared to the business segment. But what they found is producers, John Deere, said, people like Home Depot and Lowe's, Home Improvement, they know more about homeowners as consumers. These folks know more about farmers and people who are actually, farming land that may be 15, 20, 100,000 acres or whatever it might be. That's a different segment. And so I believe they felt that it might make sense if they want to get into the consumer market. Again, smaller types of products in terms of, more lawnmower types of stuff. It made sense for them to actually partner. So for them, the multi-channel they're looking at more business-to-business types of products and more consumer-oriented products. Now, one concept before we break, I'm going to break this one up into two sections, and we're going to talk a little bit about this whole concept of disintermediation. It's a fancy word, which basically says that, what we have here is some of these products and services, we're cutting out people who were historically part of the distribution channel. And one example that everybody is probably familiar with is the music industry. Once upon a time, people who made music, meaning the music companies, had all the power because everything that was created had to funnel through selling a record, as an example, physical records. And long time ago, back in the 1950s, they gave up the opportunity to actually produce any types of shows, concerts and the like. Their goal was, they said, we don't want to produce concerts. Let somebody else produce the concerts, because the produced concerts are promotional tools that'll really send demand into the stores for people to buy physical records. So that was back in the 1950s. Fast forward now into the 2010s, all the way up to the current year, in the 2013, 2014. People really like experiences. And because of technology and the MP3 compression format, many people are buying CDs, but then they're also burning copies for all their friends. So selling physical discs is no longer the way to go. And so one thing you can't replicate or duplicate is experiences. So somebody can tell you about how great the concert was, but they can't share that experience in the exact same way. So this whole disintermediation thing is coming about because many artists now are trying to and are selling directly to us as consumers and users of music. And so what they're doing is they're cutting out the record companies. And so you're seeing it in many industries where technology allows producers to sell directly to end users. You see it with books. You see it with music, as I said, even movies. And so, the people who are in the middle, either you reinvent yourself or you get squeezed out. Anyway, that's the end of part one of chapter 12. And so next we're going to step it up a little bit and talk about channel design. And so I'll see you on the other side.
That was easy.